Hey, welcome back, subscribers, to my world of stocks, and welcome back to our Ask Allah series, where I take a question from a viewer and I make a video response to it. And this time we have Trey from our community Discord over in the Is It a Buy channel, where he asked, Allah, thanks for having me on your Discord. I am new and want to ask you, what are your thoughts on AMD? I have noticed that NVIDIA trades over 4 trillion market cap, but AMD is only around 200 billion. Do you think it's a buy? You think it will cross 1 trillion? Even that would be pretty big gains. Well, first off, I want to say that I am super happy to have you in our Discord, Trey. So welcome there. And I'd be more than happy to answer this question for you in a video here. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, I do want to say, though, it's kind of funny. When I first started thinking about this question, I thought to myself, my gut tells me that AMD probably would cross $1 trillion of a market cap. And I'll explain exactly why I feel that way in just a second here. But then I also thought, wait a minute, if I think that it's going to soar over $1 trillion, then why don't I currently own the stock myself right now too? Well, that's what I'm going to try to answer as well in this video. It's going to play a bit of a role in the video where I'll give you both of the kind of bullish and bearish perspectives on the stock, but I'll also explain why I don't currently own it, at least not yet, despite leaning much more heavily towards the bullish side of the camp. So should be a fun one. Going to share my thoughts on all of this. Let's go ahead and dive straight into it. Starting first here with the more bullish kind of side of things. And yeah, this one's pretty easy for me to argue. In fact, Trey himself gave me a pretty good starting point in his comment where he noted that NVIDIA does, indeed trade for a market cap that is worth over $4.5 trillion. And yet AMD is so much further behind than them on price. In fact, AMD is ranked 45th by comparison. NVIDIA is number 1, largest in the whole world. AMD is 45th at under 300 billion. And they would therefore need to climb over 17 times larger in size just to reach NVIDIA's market cap, despite the fact that AMD actually does, in my opinion, a pretty good job of competing in the chips market, especially on the lower end of it, where they're able to still offer pretty solid performance, but at much lower prices. For example, their MI350 chips are said to undercut NVIDIA's competing offerings by a whopping 30% on price. I'm not saying that AMD is as good as NVIDIA. We all know that NVIDIA does tend to outperform and has better, much higher performance in their products. But, AMD is also coming out soon with their upcoming MI400 chips that are looking to expand much further on that in terms of performance. And I'll come back to that in just a second here. But, as such, AMD's financials are expected to really skyrocket in the coming years, especially on the bottom line, which I'll also come back to here in just a second when we cover the stock's valuation. But, this was also fueled, by the way, by their CPU line of products. It's not just on the GPU side of things. On the CPU market, AMD continues to steal market share away from Intel, which has really helped them gain notoriety in recent history. In fact, Intel used to outsell AMD CPUs by a factor of 9 to 1 just a few years ago. But today, it's only 2 to 1. And that's a monumental change for AMD, and definitely in the right direction. That strong performance, though, on the CPU side has also helped boost their overall total sales last quarter, helping them grow by a whopping 32% year over year to a new record high. In fact, speaking of sales, in recent history, AMD had been accelerating their revenue growth every single quarter up until the Chinese trading restrictions kicked in during the spring of this year, where it still only came down by a few points, which is a testament really to just how much incredible demand AMD is seeing right now, especially from artificial intelligence and the data center, where companies are really expected to spend trillions of dollars in the coming years to stay relevant in a highly competitive landscape. And even with all the international conflicts going on out there, AMD's data center revenues still grew by double digits last quarter and will very likely get boosted further down the road by those other GPUs I just mentioned earlier, especially the 400 line Once that launches next year, it's a AI accelerator that is set to double the AI compute performance from the 350 series, reaching up to 40 petaflops for FP4 workloads and featuring over 430 gigabytes of HBM4 memory. Again, the 350 series line that maxed out at just around half that amount. So this is some really powerful chips that we're talking about here that will be coming out in the near future. And I think companies are going to really look to acquire as many of those as they can get their hands on, especially given how shaky the economy is, which is actually my other bullish point on AMD, where you would think that a shaky economy would only hurt AMD's business, but because they offer lower prices, I actually think that they may see an uptick in demand from companies that are tightening their budgets in the coming years. Plus, with interest rates finally coming down, there's always a chance that companies will actually end up spending even more down the road, which would only benefit AMD even further too. In other words, I actually think that AMD has some pretty decent insulation from the volatilities of the macro economy. And that's always something nice to have in a stock that you invest in. And it's also really just because of that two-pronged approach to the chips market that AMD has taken in all these recent years, where under the leadership of Lisa Su, who, by the way, I think has been one of the greatest CEOs of our lifetime, AMD has focused heavily on, again, competing now on both price and on performance, a move that has so far worked out great for them, as the stock has soared by over 7,000% over the past decade. And yet, a couple things on this that really make me think that it could continue climbing even further regardless. Number one, we compare again to NVIDIA, who's up over 26,000% during the same time, astronomical gains that we're talking about with NVIDIA. But more importantly, we're not arguing that AMD should be worth the same as NVIDIA, but rather whether or not AMD could even reach just $1 trillion market cap over the long term. Well, to reach NVIDIA's level, it would need to climb again by another 17 times higher. But just to reach $1 trillion, it would only need to climb by around 4 times higher, which is obviously, still monumental gains. But that is just based on price alone, which obviously doesn't matter much when we're valuing a stock. What we really need to compare it to is their business. And this is where my second kind of bullish point comes from here, is that because of AMD's incredible growth on the bottom line, what I showed you earlier on this chart here, the earnings per share, well, their PEG ratio, the price to earnings to growth ratio, actually sits more than 25% lower than the sector average. That's pretty good value for a long-term growth stock like this, an investment. Now, short term, the PEs are pretty expensive, but as a long-term minded investor, I tend to care much more about metrics that look a bit further down the road. Now, they may not be quite as accurate as the more recent ones, but I tend to find that they're usually still pretty reliable, especially on high-profile stocks like AMD that do have a ton of analyst coverage. I tend to find that I can usually rely on those. Now, when it's a smaller company or more speculative type of stock without a lot of coverage, I will usually stick to either just the prior performance that is already recorded, or maybe looking out to only just like a year into their projections. But I won't really go much further than that. But again, for one that is covered as greatly as AMD is, I can look out a bit further, and that's where I really start to find a lot of value in a growth stock like this. Anyway, not to get off track, but just my point being that AMD looks like it's set up pretty well here for long-term success. And that's really because they're becoming an early leader in an AI revolution that should probably last forever into the future. And that alone just gives me the gut feeling that AMD will, in fact, become a $1 trillion company eventually at some point. The question right now, though, is whether it's worth buying near the highs instead of waiting for a dip. Well, to be clear, I'm not a huge fan of making these type of short-term minded predictions, because I believe instead that you should really just buy whichever stock you like, assuming you like the business, as long as you feel that the price is fair. And right now, I actually do think that AMD's price is very fair looking out into the future. However, there's still a couple reasons why I don't ultimately own the stock myself and would rather wait for a dip if possible. Now, number one is that I see quite a bit of uncertainty in the chips market right now, not just from all the trade tensions and barriers with China, who, by the way, is fully committed to also supporting their own homegrown companies and building competitive chips and rising up those chips companies from their own country, but also in the face of more direct rivals who are now signing even deals together, which poses a threat to AMD, like we saw with NVIDIA and Intel recently, who are partnering up to develop new AI data center hardware, as well as even consumer level chip packages that will combine Intel CPUs with NVIDIA GPUs, which, by the way, could easily threaten AMD's APU business, where they combine their own CPU and GPU into an integrated chip called an APU. Well, if you start selling a similar package there, but with superior chips from Intel and NVIDIA, it could easily start to eat away at some of that high margin business and market share from AMD, especially if they don't sell them at too high of a price point, and maybe even compete a little bit with AMD on price, which is really what has been AMD's largest competitive advantage. My bigger reason, however, for not buying the stock, at least not yet, is because I just feel that I have the luxury, really, of being able to wait for a dip, which I admit is not a luxury that everybody else has, but it is one that I do, and it's an ability that I'm choosing to exercise at this moment, simply because I already have so much large exposure to both AI in general and even chips specifically, most of which I'm already up a lot on those positions. In fact, some of my absolute largest stock positions include Microsoft, NVIDIA, Amazon, Palantir, Google, Broadcom, and more. And I even have some smaller positions in stocks like Intel and even some Chinese ones like Alibaba and Baidu, who also have a large presence and large investments into the semiconductor markets of China. And when I look at some of those positions, well, NVIDIA, for example, is literally my second largest holding at the moment, my entire personal portfolio. Well, I'm currently up over 1,500% on that stock. And while I'm not up quite as much on some of the others that I own there, most of them have still seen some pretty giant gains too. And by the way, I actually think NVIDIA will continue to outperform regardless. I know most people think that it's outrageously expensive at this moment, but when you look at the business, it's clear that it trades as high as it does for very good reason, with incredible dominance over the market at well over 90% share in both discrete GPUs and data center GPUs, while AMD sits at only around 5%. In other words, most AI hyperscalers that already exist today have already built out a ton of their infrastructure using NVIDIA's technologies. And my prediction is that whenever they'll need to either replace or even upgrade those GPUs, I think they'll probably just stick with NVIDIA because of how much it might cost them to have to migrate over to AMD's architecture instead. Another point about NVIDIA's dominance, though, is that it's allowed them to carry pricing power, which is leading to incredible margins as they continue to explode on the bottom line, leaving their PEG ratio still somehow even lower than AMD's and about 36% cheaper than the sector too. Again, despite this being literally the largest company in the world by market cap, that's pretty crazy. So, considering the business strength that they hold and still the reasonable valuation regardless, it's why I've chosen to invest in NVIDIA over AMD in recent years. But I'll leave you with just two final points here. Number one is that I used to actually own AMD stocks several years ago. In fact, there were times where it was even my largest holding, and I made a ton of money on that position. But I eventually did choose to sell out of it so that I could use the profits to help me build out an even larger position in NVIDIA, which has so far worked out extremely well for me, thankfully. But my point being that I've always been a fan of AMD, and I continue to be one to this day, even if I don't currently own shares. And number two is that if I didn't already have so much exposure to AI and chip stocks, I probably would pick up a little AMD today and then just add to it over time if any dips eventually come. Mostly because like I said, I do actually think that they would eventually at some point reach $1 trillion market cap. I think it probably will be that valuable of a company and a business. But because I'm not in that situation myself, like I said, I just feel that, it's not a stock that I need to own in my portfolio. I already have so much exposure to these markets. Thus, I'd rather just focus on what I already have and then buy some AMD stock too if it does happen to fall at any point in the future. And again, I know that that's just a luxury that, might only pertain to me. I don't know what your guys' situation is. Like, I get thousands of viewers. You're all going to have a different situation, and it's hard to make a video for all of you, but that's just how I feel about it. And that's what I'm doing myself, which is all I can really give you, I guess. But hey, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions too about all of this. Do you own AMD stock? Do you own NVIDIA? Do you own Intel or any other chips or AI related companies? I'd love to hear from you. And I hope you're all doing well, my friends, and I will catch you in the next one. All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.